Okay, so let's go over drafting. So essentially drafting is the truck's capability of filling itself. So we've got a stock tank here that we're going to practice with, and this is where we're going to be doing our training, just because we're not really allowed to pull water from the river unless it's actually in an emergency situation. So our truck's draft ports are from the back. So this is just a 3-inch cam lock, and that's where we'll be hooking up our water lines and dropping it into the water here to start drafting. Okay, so the way this works is we have a pump here. When we engage our PTO, it will turn this mechanism on, and when we go to do it, we want to make sure that this valve here is closed. This is our tank inlet valve. Now, if we were going to be driving around and using our sprayers, we would want it open. But since we're drafting, we want it closed. So before we start drafting, we actually have to get our foot valve hooked up to our suction line, and then we have to get our suction line hooked up to our draft port. Now, the foot valve is located right here in this toolbox here. Most of our fittings are going to be located in this box, and it's right on top of the toolbox. So this is it. So this is our foot valve. Now, these are very expensive, so be careful with them because they're only made out of aluminum, so don't drop them or throw them on the concrete or run them over or something like that. What this does is there's a check valve inside of there. It'll only allow the water to go this direction, and it won't let the water go this direction. So let's get that hooked up to our suction line. Now, our suction line is located right here. There's one on each side of the truck. There's another one located over here. You have just this quick disconnect latch, and the line is stored in the fender well. Typically if we're going to be actually drafting from a river, we usually have to use both of these lines because they're only 10 feet long each, and you typically are going to need about 20 feet to get into water deep enough so that you actually pull nothing but water and you don't get any air in your line. So let's get that hooked up. In order to get this hooked up to your draft line, this is a cam lock. All you do is that you open up, these are, I believe, called dog ears. You put that in there like that. Sometimes you have to take it to the ground because it takes a lot of pressure to close these, especially if you have a new gasket in there, which you're going to want because you want a good seal. But you get the idea. So as you can see here, this is a pretty good seal. These close down in nice and tight. And now you have your foot valve hooked up to your draft line. So because I'm able to get so close to the water here, I'm only going to use one draft line. Typically when you're going into like a river or a lake, the water is going to be a lot farther away, and you're usually going to have to hook both of these suction lines up. That's just not going to be the case this time. So usually what I do before I hook my draft line up to my draft port on the truck, I like to pump prime the line. Now, it's not always necessary. This line kind of floats in the water, and it's going to stay that way until it has water in it. And because of that foot valve, I can actually pump this thing. And since the water only goes one direction, it's actually going to start filling this line up. So you see how there's water in there now? So now this line has water all the way up to here, so that's going to reduce that much more air that we're going to have to bleed out later. And so all we do is we take this, same thing, we got another cam lock, and we're just going to hook it straight up to the draft port here. Now we have our foot valve hooked up to our suction line. We have our suction line full of water, and we have our suction line hooked up to our draft port. This is our draft port. Now, what I like to do is have one of these open, and then I keep another one closed because there's still a little bit of air in here, and I'd like to get it out before it enters the main line of the truck. So what I do, before you open this up, the tank valve is closed, which, if you need a reminder, you always want to make sure this is closed before you go and open that. Otherwise, your prime water will just wash straight into the bottom of the tank, and we don't want that. We need the water to prime the system. So keep that closed. And then you come up to here. Now, that priming water is held up in a reservoir inside the tank. This valve here is going to give us access to the reservoir water. The reservoir water is going to be what helps us prime the air out of this system now that we're all hooked up, because we still have a good chunk of air here, and there's going to be air in the system that we have to bleed out before we actually start drafting. So in order to get access to that water, there's a pneumatic valve here, and all we have to do is turn it on, and that opens up a valve. It's up inside the tank that gives us access to that water. Now, we've got kind of some redundancy here. We have a butterfly valve that keeps the draft port closed. Once this is open, you want to make sure that this is cocked to the side so that we can still bleed the air out here. Then we open up this one as our last little bit. And as you can see, now water is coming out, which means we've bled a good amount of air out, which is what we're looking for. So then we go to close this. We want to lock the cam lock all the way down. And we have our reservoir open, and we've got our draft port open. We're ready to draft now. So one minor flaw with this system is we're drafting from the back. Most trucks you'll see actually draft from the side, and we have a draft port here. So if for whatever reason, if it's advantageous to draft from this side, go ahead and do it. But most cases, you're gonna need to draft from the back of the truck because you're gonna be backing up to rivers and backing up to lakes. This side draft port, I didn't really like it, and so that's why we put one in the back. But because of that, we now have this line that comes back here, and the problem with it is that it goes up. And because it goes up like this, a lot of times air will get caught right here. So because air gets caught here, we actually have to bleed the system a couple of times before it'll actually start drafting on its own. And the way that we're gonna know that it's drafting is that when the truck is running and the PTO is on, you'll see the pressure gauge around 20 to 30 PSI, and that'll mean that we're drafting. Well, I mean, you'll see the needle moving. It's the gauge here needs to be replaced. To bleed out some of the air before we start, we're gonna wanna open this petcock here. So I don't know if you heard that air coming out, but, and you can see there's all kinds of air in there, and it's all getting bled out right now. You wanna make sure all of the air is out of there. So you want nothing but a stream of water coming out of there. There we go. So we know now that there's less air in there, but there's probably still some air trapped up high on this line. And so what we'll do is we'll engage our PTO a couple of times, and then we'll keep coming back. What happens is the air gets stuck in the pump, and then if there's any air in the pump, it won't create a suction. This is something I actually take pretty seriously. So this PTO is very deadly. When you are operating your PTO, you do not want to be anywhere near this thing. If you get any of your clothing caught in this, it will kill you. This is a very powerful and very dangerous piece of machinery. And so, we've got a guard here, we've got a warning to try to keep people away from it, but make absolute sure that when you're running this, you're nowhere near this thing. When I was going through diesel mechanic school, one of the kids who had graduated before me was actually killed by a PTO. So take it seriously when you're running your PTO. Stay very far away from this thing. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and try to draft. We're here in our truck, we're in our cab, and in order to draft, we want to start the truck. Got our ignition switch on, start button. That warning sound you hear is the low air warning. So we need to build a little bit of air before we start drafting. When you're drafting, air is sent to all of the sprayer valves to keep the sprayer valves shut. And so all of these sprayer valves, what they do actually is they release the air. And so when you're driving around and you're using the sprayers, what you're doing is you're releasing the air from the valve to allow the pressure to come out of it. We have the truck sitting at idle. When the truck is at idle, that's when you want to engage your PTO. And you can hear it kick on. Now, because we're pulling from such a small reservoir, I'm not going to bump up the idle. But if we were pulling from a river and we were trying to fill the whole truck up, we would actually go to this high idle, low idle. And that just helps you fill up the truck a little bit faster. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we've got the PTO on now. And what I want to do is come back and look at the gauge, the pressure gauge. And as you can see, it's not doing a whole lot. So there's a good chance there's a big air pocket in there. See, now you can see the PTO spinning. Stay away from that thing. So because there's probably air in that line, what I'm going to do is come up here. And I'm going to shut it down. And I'm just going to shut the truck off just so that you can hear me talk. But typically you would just keep the truck running. You would come here. See how much air is in there? So all that air in there was keeping it from drafting. And, you know, sometimes you have to do this 2 or 3 times. If you never run this line out of water, you shouldn't ever get air in it. But it's been my experience with these trucks. You kind of have to do this a couple times, unfortunately. So let's try it again and see if we start drafting. So it doesn't seem to be pumping again. So I'm just gonna come back here. Yep, a whole bunch of air in it. And like I said, guys, this is not a good design. It should go right away. But because I insisted on having the line go out the back, it now requires quite a bit of purging. So as you can see, we're drafting now. And you probably can't tell, but these things pull a lot of water really fast. And this is a pretty small water tank. So even at idle, it's already sucking it down pretty quick. I think this is only maximum, it's like 700 gallons. You know, these are 2,600. The whole tank will fill in like 15 minutes. So at high idle. This is low idle. We're already almost emptying this out, so I'm gonna stop drafting real quick. Another thing to note is when we go to shut this off, so let's say we're drafting from a river, right? And we've got our high idle on. Before we go to shut this off, we want to make sure to turn our idle back down again. We don't want to disengage this in high idle. And that's just because there's a clutch in there. If you do it, it'll just put more added stress on the clutch. And so that's just about it. Now, you can see the tank is already almost empty here. It didn't take long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pack this all back up. So hypothetically, we're at the river. We're filling up our truck. We're full now. We're going to pack all of our stuff back up. Don't forget to put your pins back and everything where you got it. What you do here when you're done drafting, what you want to do is you want to close this valve here, and then you want to make sure to close this valve too. If you don't close that valve, you're going to lose your reservoir water, and that's not a good thing. So once you've got those closed off, you can pack up your gear, put it back where you got it, and then you want to come back here before you hop in the truck and you want to open this up. This is your tank valve, And so this is what you're gonna have open in order to use your sprayers, because you're gonna be then pulling the water from the tank versus pulling it from the river. Whatever you do, always put everything back. This kind of stuff is really easy to get lost. You can easily leave this on the bumper and drive away with it. And if you do that, then you're never gonna have this secure. So always make sure that before you leave a drafting hole or a water hole, that you have this stuff back in place. Okay guys, that's just about it for drafting. If you have any confusion, just make sure to bring it up when we're training. If you're swapping somebody out on a fire, make sure that you go over this with them so that you know what you're doing on the fire line. We don't want to be out there and have any kind of confusion as far as how to use our own equipment. These videos are really just to kind of help you get a foundation before you show up to training. There's going to be a lot of people here, so it's going to be really helpful if you understand these videos as best as possible before you show up. Watch it, rewatch it if you have to. If not, we'll cover any kind of questions that you have when you get here. All right, I'll catch you guys later.